Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers and make a classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. In today's Kepler Conversation, I'm joined by Kepler teacher, Dr. Daniel Maycock. Dr. Maycock grew up in Georgia, where he was homeschooled and had the privilege to study under Wes Callahan in Schola Classical Tutorials throughout high school. He's earned a PhD in English Literature from the University of South Carolina, an MA in Liberal Arts at St. John's College in Annapolis, and his undergraduate work was a BA in English, a BA in Music, and he also earned a minor in philosophy in recognition of his studies that he completed at Oxford University. Daniel and his wife Haley live in South Carolina and have 3 wonderful children. Welcome, Dr. Maycock. Thanks for being with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, one of the things we'd really love to find out about our teachers is, who are you outside of the classroom? In other words, what do you like to do? What else are you involved in besides teaching? What are your hobbies?
Right. Well, like a lot of folks, I think it's kind of hard to have hobbies because we stay so busy with everything. But one of the things that I've really gotten into, and it provides this weird intersection between a lot of my interests, actually is sailing. I've only been sailing once, but it's become an obsession of mine to the point where I actually am in the process of building a 9-foot sailboat. It's a collapsible. Let me show you.
Yeah.
I have the keel right here in my office because there's nowhere else to put it.
That's
so I've got the keel here. I've got the various ribs of my boat also here behind me, just sort of stacked up against my bookshelf. And so it's fun because it's just well, I mean, like I said, I've only been sailing once. Hopefully I'll be sailing a lot more after this. But the great thing about it is that it provides you with, in the process of building the boat, you're thinking about all the geometric relationships between the materials. You're physically engaged with the materials, which is a lot of fun, especially for somebody who teaches online. It feels really good to work with your hands and actually do something, real and tangible. And the sailing experience itself is fascinating to me because you're relying on weather and the wind, and it's reacting to these things which are outside of your control and are much more powerful than you are. And there's also, here's the literary connection. Everyone loves the sea. I mean, there's countless books written about the sea. Poets are always talking about the sea. And so in one fun way, it's like this intersection of a lot of the things that I'm interested in. So that's been a hobby of mine, sort of off and on. And the fun thing is it's here in my office because I don't have a place for it. But one day it'll be done, I hope.
I love that you're actually building your own sailboat. That to me is phenomenal. Have you by chance read Matthew Crawford's Shop Class as Soulcraft? Have you read that book?
I haven't. I've heard about it, but I have not read it.
Well, he makes the very connection that you just described in how, working with your hands cannot be divorced from, theory in our head, the things that we have in our head, and connecting with our hands, that there's a kind of knowledge that comes not just because we can read a schematic or read about boats, but actually putting your hand in it and creating this thing. And sailing is going to be, a kind of knowledge that you can't get otherwise. So I love that you just described that. You're actually building your own boat. I love it.
Yeah, it started off where I was supposed to, the easy thing to do was to go buy a boat. But I decided I'll just build one. And so I don't know why I had that idea, but here we are.
Why do the easy thing, right?
That's right. Yeah, my entire life has been looking at 2 possibilities and going, well, this one's easier. I think I'll do the other one.
Right. That's fantastic. Well, in your bio, you talked about being homeschooled with Schola Tutorials and Wes Callahan. Can you talk a little bit about your homeschooling experience? I mean, obviously part of it was classical. What brought you to classical education? I'd love to hear that.
Sure. Yeah. So my education was as classical as my mother could figure out how to make it, which in those days there were not nearly as many resources for classical education. So what that meant was I had a year of Latin, and it was only a year because I had a terrible attitude about it. And so she eventually said, "Okay, that's fine. You don't have to keep going. A year is enough." Because I was just complaining and complaining. In retrospect, I should have been more appreciative of what she was giving me. But I had a year of Latin, and then for the other classical aspect, my mother put me in Wes's classes. So I had 4 years of great books with Wes, and also did classical rhetoric with him, and that was phenomenal. I mean, he's really the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now, is because I thought, well, I want to be like that guy. uh, so, um, so that was essentially how my homeschool experience was. It was great. I learned a lot. I really appreciated studying under Wes. Um, and the stuff that Wes introduced me to through his classes really set the stage, I think, for everything else that I ever did. Um, Going into English, especially for my undergrad, and then going on to St. John's, um, and beyond. I ended up getting into classical education after I graduated. So at this point, I had been interested in education. I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I was mostly teaching music because it was a little bit easier to just do that as gig work. But I wanted to get involved teaching, some other things like English or philosophy or something in a classroom setting. And so, um, because of the groundwork that I had, and because of my appreciation for the great books of the Western canon, I wanted to do something in a classical school because I wasn't going to get the chance to do anything like that anywhere else. So I ended up teaching for a year at a small classical school in Greenville here in South Carolina. Um, and that was a great experience. So I taught some literature classes, some logic classes, maybe a couple other classes. I forget. It was one of those where they just hand you, like 5 different classes.
Yeah, right. There
Yeah.
you go.
Right.
Well, so
Yeah.
one of the big arguments we always hear. So I'm kind of putting you on the spot or setting you up just because I want to hear the answer to this. But why waste your time studying English or the great books? What are you ever going to do with a liberal arts education? How are you going to make anything of your life? What is your answer to that question that we hear posed so often?
Yeah. I think that the answer there are at least two parts to this answer. I think the first part, which is the one everyone's more or less familiar with, which is, well, studying these books and doing literature and whatnot, it teaches you how to think.
Mhm.
Because you're interacting with these ideas and you're having to wrestle with these ideas, interpret these ideas, and there's a lot of value in doing exactly that. Learning how to think by engaging with the best thinkers of the Western world. Um, Arguably, maybe perhaps even the best thinkers of all time. So that's the first part, and those skills transcend discipline. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you go into astrophysics or something. I think that you can learn something that would be applicable, maybe not directly to astrophysics, but to your life in general, and as well to the, I don't know how to say this except to say something like the general climate of your life, which will influence what you're doing with astrophysics. Um, but I think that all those things can benefit from reading Augustine, Shakespeare. I mean, there's something there which you can draw, I think, and it would be applicable across any discipline. So that's the first part. The second part is related to this, and it's when you encounter these ideas, and you encounter things that are truly good and beautiful. I mean, it does something to your soul.
Mhm.
It molds your soul in a particular way, which is good for you. Um, and this kind of cultivation of beauty and virtue and truth and all these things that we hold so dear. I mean, this happens, I think, in a proper study of literature, and that, I mean, is it going to make you a better? Well, I'll say it like this: is it going to make you a richer businessman? Probably not. Will it make you a better person? Well, if you do the work, right? If you take these things to heart, it's really dependent upon the student himself. But the answer is yes, I think.
Yeah.
If you are, in one sense, to borrow and to misappropriate Jesus's parable of the sower, if you are the right kind of soil for the literature and for these books and for these ideas, I mean, it's going to enrich your life, and that's worth doing regardless of what you do with the rest, as a career, because life isn't about a career. So, I mean, that's part of life, but that's not the point.
Yeah.
Life is so much bigger than that.
Yeah, I think in our modern Western context, we often, reduce it to that. And the very first question people always ask is, "What do you do for a living?" Right? Because in some ways we identify people by their, their vocation or the work that they're doing. Related to what you just said, it just reminded me of one of the first times it struck me early on in my own classical education and reading the great books, is reading Seneca, who said that the liberal arts prepares the soul to receive virtue. It doesn't impute it, but it prepares the soul to receive it. And I found that fascinating, given the fact that Seneca was Nero's tutor and tried to get away, right? And eventually was forced to kill himself, but to get away because Nero, while he was prepared, didn't receive virtue, obviously. And, so it was just interesting to think that the way Seneca was so very careful to phrase it that way, that it doesn't impart it, it doesn't make a person virtuous, but it certainly prepares. It's the soil that you just talked about, preparing the soil to receive that. So anyway, fascinating, just reminded me of it.
Yeah.
Well, you're, as a teacher, of course, you're teaching, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're teaching in several contexts, obviously here at Kepler, but you're teaching, I think, some university courses and I think maybe another online institution. Can you talk a little bit about your teaching experience, where you're teaching, what you're teaching, and why you're teaching the way you are?
Sure. So I'm not teaching at the university at the moment. I just finished my PhD this year, and so a couple of years, well, more than a couple of years ago, toward the beginning of my PhD, which was a very long process, I had some teaching assistantships. So I was teaching freshman English, like 101 and 102, and I did that for a couple of years and hated it. And it was because my hands were tied and I felt like I couldn't actually give the students what they needed, which was a lot of times what they actually needed was kind of like basic logic and remedial English in a lot of time, in a lot of ways. And the stuff that we were reading wasn't stuff that was going to be good for them, which was the other thing. They were being exposed to ideas that they didn't have the capacity to actually deal with in any kind of an effective way. And so what you ended up having was students were just sort of forced to pick sides without actually thinking through the material. It was like, oh, here's a position. Do I agree or disagree? Whereas that's not really the best way to always approach a book. You have to have a little bit more of a nuanced approach and say, well, maybe I can't just swallow the whole thing or reject the entire thing. Maybe there's some room here for, analyzing this on a little more carefully, and they just weren't able to do that. So I ended up giving that up. And what I do now is I teach for Memoria Academy. So I'm the head of the math department there. And here at Kepler, I'm also teaching a few math classes. So not English, which confuses people. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something I want to talk about, and I want to talk about it in the most positive way, because I absolutely love this aspect of classical education, this aspect of an integrated great books education that or a truly liberal arts education, if we understand that in its most classical sense of what that means. So here you are as an English major teaching Euclidean geometry here, at least at Kepler, Euclidean geometry and classical algebra. And how on earth that's not in your subject domain, that's outside your scope of practice or your scope of study. How on earth could you justify? And I hope you hear the tongue in cheek there in my tone. But how can you justify teaching math as an English major?
No, yeah, I think that's certainly a very valid question. Um, so maybe I should address too why I'm not teaching English, because people might wonder, well, why aren't you doing this other thing instead, which would be the obvious choice? You have a PhD in English, you studied English, why not English? So part of the reason is actually just a really basic practical one, which was my PhD took me about 8 years to do. And in that time, I was doing lots of reading and lots of writing. And when you're doing lots of reading and lots of writing, one of the last things you want to do is have to do additional reading in preparation for classes, and then also read additional essays, and whatnot. And so I had done some teaching of math already. And so as the chance arose to continue to teach math, that was what I did, because it provided me with a kind of counterbalance to what I was doing as I was, studying English and writing and all this stuff with my PhD. So that's the reason why I'm not teaching English. Eventually, I hope to go back to English and start teaching that again. But for the time being, I'm very happy doing math. And the way that I got into math was what kind of began when my mother put me through Saxon many, many years ago. Now, some people love Saxon, and so if anybody listening loves Saxon, that's totally fine. I did not like Saxon. In fact, when I got my master's degree, we had an entire semester where we did math and science. And that was the first time I was introduced to Euclid beyond just having him somewhere as a footnote in a textbook.
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked through the first book of Euclid's Elements, and I thought, my goodness, this is amazing. It's beautiful. Why have I never experienced math like this before? And all I could think about was the time that I had spent studying Saxon math and thinking I couldn't see how any of the pieces fit together when I was going through Saxon. Maybe that was my fault. Maybe it was the fault of the book. Regardless, the point is I was having a really difficult time as a student connecting all these ideas. And so it felt to me like I was just trying to memorize things that had very little relation to each other. And I didn't understand why the things I was doing worked. And that was really, really frustrating. So suddenly having a very different experience in grad school and going, wow, math, not only do I see all of the connections, not only does this make perfect sense, but I can see the beauty and the logic. And I'd never seen the beauty in mathematics before. So that was the thing that really got me interested in math. And after I graduated, I began working on what has become my geometry course, where I teach through 5 books of Euclid's Elements. So I teach books 1 through 3, and then 5 and 6. So those 5 books. We skipped the 4th one. So that grew out of what I did immediately after graduating, because I thought the classical world needs a better way to do geometry, and I think we should just do Euclid. I mean, Euclid's phenomenal. You get the groundwork of high school geometry in a completely different way, a way that opens you up to the beauty of the logic. And you can begin to see, even when you're doing this, also why, for instance, Plato would famously say that you need to be able to do geometry if you want to do philosophy. I'm paraphrasing badly, but and so all of those connections really led me into pursuing mathematics in a semi-professional way on the side. And over time, that just continued to grow and grow and grow. And so now like I said, I'm head of the math department at Memoria Academy, and I've now been teaching math since 2013. So I've been doing it for a little while. And it's it's fantastic. And one of the things I love to be able to show students is all of the connections. And I think the
Mhm.
thing that I bring to math education as an English person is the ability to make some of these connections, especially cross-disciplinary connections, which um, maybe escape other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about liberal arts, often in our modern context, people forget about the fact that liberal arts isn't, gender studies or the history of rock and roll, but it literally is a grammar, logic, rhetoric that prepares you and moves you into math,
Mhm.
geometry, music, or harmony and astronomy. Like that's all part of a truly liberal arts education. And it's an integrated education, a cosmos of understanding. And so it would be natural if anyone understood classically how a classical liberal arts works. It would be very understandable that you might take a PhD and study specific things in English literature while also being head of a math department. That would make total sense in a in a world that wasn't where we're at in modern education today. So um,
Right.
well, Dr. Maycock, as we're kind of winding down our time, one of the things I also love to hear is some nugget from, you maybe it's Euclidean geometry, maybe it's classical algebra, but from the courses you're teaching here at Kepler, at least, is there some compelling little piece that you would share with us to kind of whet our appetite?
Yeah. So one of the things I always like to share with my students whenever I'm teaching math is at some point along along the year or in the year, somebody's bound to ask the question, when am I going to use this? Why do I have to learn this? Is it really going to help me? And the
I've
answer is
never heard
usually, you've never heard that.
that.
Why do I need to know the quadratic formula? Is it going to help me balance my checkbook? And who uses checks? Um, yeah, the answer is no. Like most of the time, no. Beyond this class, you're never going to use it. And then most of the time students get responses like, but you should learn it anyway because it's hard and it's painful and it's good for your character, which is really dissatisfying to a student who's having to do this hard and painful thing. So what I like to give my students is a non-pragmatic defense of math that basically argues that math is worth studying for its own sake and it has nothing to do with whether or not it's actually useful. And one of the things that I like to point out, I'll just give you one. One of the things I like to point out is that math is beautiful. And most of the time, my students don't believe me. And they say, I don't know about this. I've been doing math now for quite a few years. Never once has it been beautiful. And I have to explain, say, well, think about what beauty is. Where do we find beauty? And I would like to suggest that we find beauty in relationships. And so the Greeks understood this, and so when the Greek sculptors and the painters and whatnot, they were obsessed with proportions.
Yeah.
And so they were on this quest to find the ideal proportions of the human body to create the most beautiful person imaginable, right, in sculpture, and to create the ideal. And so in this quest for the ideal, they're relating things to each other, right? How tall should a person be in relation to the size of their feet, the size of their arms, size of their legs, right? Size of their head. How big should the ears be compared to the nose, and all these different things. But these are all relationships. Um, and even in literature, we find beauty in things that are relational, like even metaphor, for example, is a kind of relationship between two things that we tend to think of as not being related. And so the fact that, oh, even painting, here's another one, right? Things exist in relationship, and there are different types of relationships. There's shape, there's color, there's contrast. But all of these things are beautiful or not in relationship. And this is also super clear in music, because it's in music where we have harmony and dissonance. What's the difference between them? Well, it's the relationship between all of those different pitches. And so the thing that makes something beautiful or ugly, I think, is being either in the right relationship or the wrong relationship, however you want to characterize that. And the same is true of math. And so the thing that makes mathematics beautiful is that it in itself, it's an exploration of relationship. It's basically all it is. It's an exploration of relationship between ideas And most of those ideas concern numbers. But it's exactly that. What we're doing in mathematics is we are looking for the harmonies that emerge in what is true. And so that's what I like to give my students as an effort to try to tell them, look, you may not believe me. Math is beautiful. You may not see it yet, but one day, Lord willing, you'll get to a point where you'll go, oh, I can see now with all these different relationships, everything that I've been doing, I can begin to see how it fits together. And I can see that this does actually constitute a very beautiful thing. And what I always pray is that, in seeing this, the students will have a deeper appreciation for not just for mathematics, but ultimately for this universe and the God who created it. Because that's really ultimately where all of this is going.
I love that you use that idea of beauty in math, and it again takes us back to even just kind of our namesake, Johannes Kepler, and exploration of the universe and eclectics and all the aspects of beauty and harmony and proportion that that he brought to bear or in discovery, and in addition to that, it's interesting to me that while he's working out this beautiful mathematical formula, something that inspires him, he'll write a poem to the glory of God on the opposite page, because it just this thing that he worked out was so beautiful and inspiring that he loved it, as some eccentric or something.
Yeah, math and literature together.
Well, I could sit and visit with you all day. So many great things that we could unpack. But thank you so very much for giving some time today to talk about your courses and your education.
Thank you.
And all of Dr. Maycock's courses and links to what he's doing will be in the show notes. So if you have questions, you'll be able to contact him, take a look at his courses, and I hope you come take a Euclidean geometry or a classical algebra course this fall. God bless you, Dr. Maycock.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.